I have family members who are undocumented and live in danger every day.
Yeah.
As president, what will you do to stop deportation agents from tearing more families apart?
So, first of all, we need a president of these United States who understands that we are a nation of immigrants, and instead of vilifying folks because he's trying to scapegoat folks to distract from the fact that he ain't done nothing, we need to have a president of the United States who understands that if we are going to be true to the values of who we say we are, if we are going to be true to the actual history of what created us and who we are, then we will have a commitment from the President of the United States, which is the President of the United States I will be, that will pass comprehensive immigration reform, that will stop allowing the United States government to commit a human rights abuse at the border, which is what this family separation policy has been. I will be a president of the United States that keeps our word to those dreamers that we gave DACA protection instead of pulling it out. I will be a president who understands that those young people who are DACA recipients and dreamers did not just fall out of the sky onto the earth. They have parents who also deserve protection. And we just need a president of the United States who uses her bully pulpit in a way that understands that if we are going to be strong as a country, we must be committed to our stated values. That's part of what has given us strength on this globe. And right now we are ceding that power when we have a president of the United States that is using that bully pulpit to divide and to sow hate. We've got to end that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Senator, as a brief follow-up to the last question, what would be your immediate action in the first 100 days related to tent cities and detained migrants and the whole infrastructure that's been set up at the border?
Yeah. So first of all, what we have to do is that there needs to be real resources that are put into allowing these families to have their process for determining their status in terms of, in particular, asylum. And again, we need to, this is the problem, part of the problem with the issue is that it has been mischaracterized by very powerful people. Let's understand what's happening. We have families that are fleeing murder capitals of the world. Most people don't want to leave their home. Like, just think about the nature of it. Most people don't want to leave the place where they were born, where their parents were born, where their grandparents were born, with the place that is familiar to them, the culture that is familiar to them. When people leave, it is usually because they have to. So let's first of all understand the nature of what we're talking about. Okay, so then we are talking about what have been documented to be murder capitals of the world. Then let's talk about the fact that there are families who have made a decision, parents who have made a decision to put their children in what they know could be a perilous journey of traveling through the entire country of Mexico to come to the United States because those parents decided the fate that they are now facing if they stay at home is worse than what they may endure. And then what happens when they arrive at our borders? We, who have erected the Statue of Liberty, they arrive at our borders and we say, go back to where you came from. That is inhumane and it is immoral. And so I come at the subject from that perspective.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.